Khαίrete, friends. Welcome to Classics in Color, your weekly dive into some of the ancient world's wackiest facts. I'm Mark Graves. Today we're going to be talking about animals enlisted in ancient warfare. My major source for this video, and therefore your source if you want to dive in even further than the scope of this video, should be the excellent book entitled Greek Fire, Poison Arrows, and Scorpion Bombs by Adrian Mayer. We have plenty of stories to get through today, and I'm going to start off with the ones that are about creepy crawlies, bugs, insects, etc. And specifically, we're going to start off with a story about the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus when he was besieging the ancient city of Hatra. So Hatra apparently was in a region that was infamous for its abundant scorpion population. Apparently these critters were just everywhere, and the king of that city would regularly put out bounties to encourage people to go out and round up and kill as many of them as they possibly could. And therefore it's quite likely that scorpions are the critters involved in this next story. But the people of Hatra vigorously defended themselves by firing down missiles and stones onto the army of Severus below, and causing them a good deal of damage. They made clay containers filled with little flying insects that had poisonous stings, which were then fired off. When these missiles fell onto Severus's army, the insects crawled into the eyes and exposed parts of the skin of the soldiers without being noticed and stung them, causing severe injuries. The soldiers could not stand the stifling atmosphere caused by the excessive heat of the sun and began to fall ill and die. The result was that most of the army was wiped out in this way rather than in battle. As I said, what is most likely being described in this passage is a very clever use of this population's excess of scorpions. But other people have proposed other animals, so it could be an assassin bug. Apparently these little guys have wings and very sharp little beaks that will inject a nerve poison that dissolves flesh while they suck out their victim's blood. So very fearsome. It could also be wasps or Peterin beetles, and Peterin beetles also apparently inject a venom that can cause sores, blindness, and even death. So I cannot say for sure which of these it is or if it's something else that we haven't even considered, but all of them seem to be wonderfully terrible animals to have to deal with in a battle situation. You might think that throwing scorpions in pots at your enemy might be a bit of an exotic and usual practice in ancient warfare, not something that comes up on a regular basis. But if you look in ancient manuals on military strategy and technology, using insects actually comes up more than once. So we're going to take a look at two passages back to back, both of which recommend using wasps, specifically in the scenario where an enemy is trying to dig or tunnel into your besieged city. And if at any point the tunnel comes into the ditch, throw the wood and the shavings there and set fire to them. Then cover the rest of the ditch so that the smoke penetrates the tunnel and injures those inside. Indeed, it is possible that the smoke will kill many. Some have even released wasps and bees into the opening and caused distress to those in the tunnel. The besiegers of this place brought up towers, built mounds, and dug tunnels so large that subterranean battles could be fought in them. The inhabitants cut openings into these tunnels from above and thrust bears and other wild animals and swarms of bees into them against the workers. I love bees. I want a little monument in honor of their brave service. I think that would be adorable. But moving on to some other animals, there is a very interesting story about the Persian king Cambyses while he was attempting to conquer basically all of Egypt. So apparently he was besieging this particular city, Pelusium, which was key in his strategy, again, to taking over all of Egypt. So it's a very important battle, very high stakes, and he comes up with the very creative, strange, dastardly plan of putting hordes of animals in front of his army, and all of the animals are ones that are known to be sacred to the Egyptians. So I assume he got a bunch of ibises and scarabs and cats and crocodiles and all of that good stuff and just put them out in front of his soldiers, hoping that that would deter the Egyptian archers from firing at his troops. And apparently it worked. Apparently they did not, and he ended up winning the day. So that is a really cool story in which the animals probably didn't have to fight or kill or die at all. Probably the most widely used animal in the ancient military was the horse, of course. And I don't have any stories for you today, at least, about people using horses in interesting ways, but I do have some interesting stories or facts about people countering the use of horses. So if you are an infantry or you're foot soldiers and you're facing a cavalry, then you want to try to negate the advantage that the cavalry has. And what people would usually try to do is to spook those horses. Horses are apparently very easy to spook, and so you would get very creative in coming up with different ways to do this. And what they would often use was other animals. So they might try to round up a couple of elephants, which it makes sense why elephants would intimidate horses, but you could also get together a couple of camels or donkeys, and that could apparently work as well. Apparently horses get very skittish around those animals. Speaking of using animals to ward off other animals, we have a great story about Antigonus Gonatas, who was a Macedonian king and who was besieging the Greek city of Megara. And apparently he had a troop of elephants that he was using to attack the city, and the people of the city, the Megarians, I guess, came up with a wickedly genius plan of rubbing up pigs with pitch and then lighting the pitch on fire and setting the pig loose to run through the enemy ranks. And this quite understandably disturbed and spooked the elephants. Finally, we're going to look at some stories about the great and terrible, the scourge of the Romans, Hannibal. Hannibal is obviously a famously intelligent and gifted general, and sometimes some of his strategies involved really bizarre but really creative and clever uses of animals. So our first story comes from Livy. It's about the Battle of Auger, but the quote is really long, so I'm not going to read the whole thing here. I'll just do my best to summarize it for you. So the context is that Hannibal wants to move his troops. He wants to get into a better location, but he's worried that while his troops are all spread out and in transit, that the Romans will attack him while he's not ready. And so what he decides to do is round up tons of cattle, as many as he can find in the scavenged farmland around him, and he ties torches basically to their horns. Then he waits until night, waits until dark, and then he sets those torches on fire and drives the cattle ahead of his troops. So it's at night, the Romans are from a distance, and what they see is just this blaze of all of these torches, and so it makes his troops, his forces, look way bigger. It looks like he's got way more soldiers than he actually does, and this intimidates the Romans. They don't attack him right away, and he has all the time he needs to get into a better position. And of course, Hannibal is way too smart to use a good trick only once. He does this again later actually, but this time with sheep. So he gets a bunch of sheep and he ties like sticks and branches and brooms to their tails, poor little guys, and then he drives all of these sheep ahead of the army, and this kicks up so much dust that again, from a distance, it gives the impression that his army is way bigger than it actually is. Last but not least, we're going to see Hannibal use a stratagem very similar to the one that we looked at the beginning of this video. So in this story, Hannibal is engaged in a naval battle and he is way outnumbered. The enemy has way more ships than he does. So what he does in preparation for this battle is he orders all of his soldiers to go out and catch as many snakes as they possibly can, and then to stuff those snakes into jars. When the other Pergamene ships began to press their opponents too hard, on a sudden, the earthenware jars of which I have spoken began to be hurled at them. At first, these projectiles excited the laughter of the combatants, and they could not understand what it meant. But as soon as they saw their ships filled with snakes, terrified by the strange weapons and not knowing how to avoid them, they turned their ships about and retreated to their naval camp. Thank you so much for checking out this video. Let me know in the comments below, of all the animals we talked about in this video, which one do you think you could take in a fight? Special thank you as always to subscribers and to Patreon members, and I hope to see all of you again next week. Χαίρετε.